Most growers and a lot of small-scale gardeners keep some kind of record of what was planted when, where, and how. Often this is simply an updated version of a basic planting plan, but a lot more detail can be added, especially when learning, exploring, or trying something new. Information, records, and data has always been an important part of this Red Gardens project, especially as it has focused so much on comparing different gardening methods or techniques. In many ways, figuring out the best process and techniques of recording and managing this data has been a parallel process to figuring out how to adapt and manage the different gardens themselves. There has been a process of trial and error, of exploring different options and tools to try to figure out what works best for me in this context. A significant part of all of this is to figure out what kind of information I need to record, how best to record it, and perhaps more importantly, how much data is enough and how much is possibly too much. The most important pieces of information to keep track of is the details of what was planted where and when, and this is typically tied in with the planting plan. This became a lot more important as I developed more gardens and grew more and more crops in each of them, as it was way too much information for me to keep in my head. I've tried a diverse range of different methods over the years, including blogs, mind maps, and overlays on a drawing, but I settled on putting all of these details into a cloud-based notebook app. I set up a note for each crop that I plan to grow in each of the gardens, containing all of the planting details, and I could access and add to this information in the gardens with my smartphone and from my computer at home. And adding a notification to each note indicating when tasks needed to be done gave me a weekly to-do list, which I tried to keep on top of. During the season, I added details of how the crop was managed, as well as updates, including photos and any notes that I felt were relevant. This was primarily qualitative data, descriptions of how the crop developed, and information about the crop details. And at the end of the season, I also added a summary of the other data, including overall yields. These notes have become a permanent record of all of the crops in one place, which have been useful for reference, for looking back and comparing, and I found them a lot more useful when I had taken photos and notes throughout the growing season, but not too many. I've found that they are only really useful when the notes are complete. Or more accurately, a lack of consistency makes this data less valuable or harder to access and understand what happened. Of course, all this information takes time, adding additional tasks in the middle of a busy growing season, as well as compiling and summarizing all of the other data at the end of the season. If I'm going to do it, I need to do it right throughout the year, not just during the enthusiasm of the beginning of the season, which is what I've tended to do in the past. The weight of the crops that I harvest is one of the main qualitative data or measurement that I want to keep track of for all of the different crops. Yield is one of the main forms of comparison that I can make between the individual crops in all of the gardens, and the overall productivity of the gardens themselves. It is relatively simple to weigh everything that I harvest, though there are some variables that I've needed to sort out, such as whether to include the tops of the carrots when weighing. But this is fine so long as I maintain consistency across the different gardens and from one season to the next. Weighing each crop that I harvest and recording the information adds additional tasks on a very frequent basis, especially with a lot of the summer and salad crops that can be harvested several times a week. Over the full season last year, I harvested, weighed, and recorded individual crops over 3,000 times from all of the different gardens, and that is a lot of work. So I have needed to find a way to make the process to record the information very efficient, as well as easy to compile and to analyze the data later, and entering everything directly into a spreadsheet became the best option. Fairly recent developments in technology have definitely helped here, where I use a spreadsheet app on my smartphone which has a handy form capability that makes inputting data a lot easier, especially if I've properly formatted the spreadsheet to begin with. And this is automatically uploaded to the cloud, which allows me to do the more complicated work on a computer at home. The amount of time that I spend managing the gardens is the other key numerical data that I keep track of. It is a really useful way to compare different gardens, as some take a lot less work than others, and this is an important consideration for a lot of people. While weighing everything and recording each crop separately makes a lot of sense, I found it to be more difficult to figure out how much time-related detail is enough and how much is too much. It would be easiest to simply log the time that I spend in each of the gardens, recording the amount of minutes or hours before moving on to the work in the next gardens. But tracking the amount of time that I spend on different tasks helps to better understand the differences between the gardens and also where efficiencies can be made. Keeping track of the time that I spend managing each individual crop might be too much, even though this is something that I've tried in the past few years. It can be quite easy to add this data into a spreadsheet, and this finer detail is definitely useful to compare crops from different gardens. For example, last year I was able to determine how much time I spent on the same crop of carrots in 6 different gardens, or to calculate that harvesting the runner beans takes more time than most other tasks. But it is a lot of extra work, as it's a lot easier and faster to keep track of the time spent weeding the full garden, for example, rather than the time spent weeding each individual crop. As with other types of data, tracking time in any detail is only useful if I'm consistent for the full season. And I've also found that I often forget to track the time when I'm busy just getting on with the work. In addition, measuring time is not really that reliable, as it's prone to a lot of variables, such as how quickly I'm working that day or how many distractions I have while working, so there can be a certain amount of estimation involved. This is made even more complicated now that a friend is helping me in the gardens, as this adds more work to keep track of everything, and I need to include a type of fudge factor depending on who is doing the work, or if we are working together, as we naturally work at different speeds related to the differences in our experiences and skills. My approach to all this data management has evolved over the years, but my current setup is that everything is included in one spreadsheet format, except for photographs, which I still add to the individual notes for each crop. All of the tasks that I do, the harvest, the details of sowing, as well as observations are entered into the same spreadsheet. Every line of the spreadsheet starts by entering the date and time with a click of a button, and a finish time if appropriate, so that the number of minutes can be automatically calculated. I include a time factor that approximates the difference depending on who is doing the task, though this is a really rough estimation. Then I select the abbreviated codes for each garden from a pop-up menu, and the task or type of information that is being recorded from another pop-up menu. Then I specify the individual crop or range of crops, if appropriate, and each one has a 3-letter code plus a number, for example, to differentiate early carrots from storage carrots. If it is a harvest, I record the weight using grams, and the number that I harvested if relevant, such as how many cucumbers I picked. More recently, I have included a designation of the garden bed as well, as this is useful for keeping track of stuff like fertility that is added. It's also useful for cross-referencing and for spotting errors that I make in designating the crop or the garden, something that I do occasionally which can really mess up the data. I then have a space to note any relevant information such as planting details, what fertility was added, as well as crop-specific observations which I used to add to the notebook, but I find that it is much easier to enter all of this into one spreadsheet. In order to avoid having to work with an overly large spreadsheet, I enter all the data for each week into a separate file and then compile each week's data into one spreadsheet for the year, which last year had over 4,000 lines of data. This year, I've also started detailing and tracking the planting plan for the season in the same format, and I can add each week's sowing details as well as any other tasks directly into the weekly spreadsheet as a type of to-do list. This eliminates double entry of details and actually makes it easier to access and record information when in the gardens, and I'm less likely to forget to do the tasks that need to be done. Of course, the only reason for recording all of this data is to be able to use it later, and it's taken me quite a while to develop a system where it's really easy to access and analyze all of this information. I have made things difficult for myself in the past and left a lot of work compiling and transferring all this data from one format to another, but it has become much more streamlined in recent years. I can now simply filter all of the data on one spreadsheet to show only details relating to one crop in one garden, and all the relevant information is in one place. When the crop is finished, I simply copy this information into the specific note for that crop as a permanent record of all of the tasks, planting details, observations, and harvest details, together with any photographs that I've taken. I can also filter the information for a specific bed to see the history of fertility amendments, or to easily filter harvests and quickly get a total yield from a specific garden, or of a particular crop from all of the gardens. At the end of the season, I still compile a summary of yields and times into another spreadsheet so that it's easier to compare across seasons. This is still a fair amount of work, but it's mostly done in the winter, and it's an important part of a research project, and this becomes the basis of a lot of the analysis within all of these videos I make. One of the issues with collecting data and information is that I don't really know what I'm going to want to use in the future. There is a trade-off between collecting and recording as much as possible throughout the season, and not wanting this process to take up too much of my time. I've definitely learned that the more efficient and integrated the data is, and the easier it is to input and to access, the more I can deal with before it is too much. But I'm still trying to find a balance between recording more detailed information and getting the job done. While I have found it useful to be able to compare how much time I spent on individual crops, this level of detail is probably too much going forward. So, for example, this season I won't be recording how long it takes to weed individual crops. Instead, I'll only track the time for weeding the full garden. With another person helping in the gardens this year, the time-based information is already going to be less accurate. But getting exact details of how much time I spent on a particular crop is not really the point, as approximate relative comparisons between the gardens is more useful in my opinion. As with many areas of exploration, we often only know the boundary of what is useful or appropriate by passing it, and I did that in the past few years. While I still plan to accurately record weights and to try to be consistent with noting observations about how each of the crops is doing, I won't be keeping such detailed records of the amount of time spent on the general care and management of each crop. I'm also going to accept that the records of time spent in general will be less accurate, and that's okay, as it makes it easier to work on a day-to-day basis. This is part of finding a balance between not having enough information to be useful and not having the process take up so much time that I'd really rather spend growing, learning, and making more videos. If I wasn't managing this research project and trying to share my experiences as widely as possible, I would drastically reduce the amount of information that I keep track of, but having some records is always a useful thing when managing a growing space. In the end, all of this data is simply a tool to help me get better at doing other things, not an end in itself. And I'm getting better at figuring out how much data is appropriate for the context that I'm in and the rapidly changing world around me.